Hi guys, we're on chapter 29, Civil Rights, Vietnam, and the Ordeal of Liberalism. This is a good chapter. We start with the election of JFK. Remember, JFK is the youngest president elected. He was young and charismatic. His difference from all the 34 other presidents that came before him was he was Catholic. And there was a big question on, was that okay, was that not okay? Was he going to listen to the Pope, or was he going to do what the United States wanted? If you look at this electoral picture that's here, Kennedy is the green, Richard Nixon is the orange. Okay, Richard Nixon is the VP for Eisenhower at this time. Everybody thought it would really be a shoo-in and Nixon would get elected. But we've seen some changes in our country during this time, and we also seen where JFK, he was so charismatic, him and Jackie Kennedy were young and vibrant, and Nixon didn't come off well on the TV. And with that, Kennedy wins. Also look at Oklahoma here. This is when Oklahoma split its decision on how electoral votes were going to go. We're a winner-take-all state now, but at that time, 7 electoral votes went with Nixon, and 1 went with Harry Byrd, who was a Dixiecrat, an independent candidate who didn't carry a lot of votes. JFK has one of the famous quotes that come up at this time. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow Americans of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. He was inaugurated on January 20th, 1961. He was wealthy, handsome, and he was only 43. Kennedy looked and spoke better than Nixon. They felt that he was weak on communism compared to Nixon. And Nixon had more experience in the White House because he had been vice president for 8 years and was a former governor. Kennedy's mystique with the press portrayed Kennedy as young, attractive, energetic. They were a stylish couple with attention to art, culture, and everyday family, modern. It was a modern-day Camelot. Mrs. Kennedy spoke 5 languages, and she was fluent in French, and she was well put together, and people liked that about them. They felt the old guard was going away, and this young, new, vibrant area would come in. Kennedy is assassinated November 22nd, 1963. He was assassinated in Dallas while on a southern tour to drum up support for his policies. As we all know, he was shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. The alleged assassin was arrested in the Dallas movie theater shortly after, and he allegedly killed a Dallas police officer. Oswald was killed a few days later by Jack Ruby, who was affiliated with the mafia. With Kennedy's assassination, there is still, all these years later, questions on, was it a lone gunman? How many shots really was it? There have been lots of speculation on this. The Warren Commission, ordered by President Johnson, stated Oswald was the lone assassin. The country went into mourning when Kennedy was assassinated, and we had the first transfer of power on an airplane with the current president in a casket and the next president being sworn into the Oval Office. Lyndon Johnson, he's from Texas. He had been a senator for years. He is known for really being a good politician. He went very far in the Senate, and people really liked him. They talked about the Johnson treatment, where Johnson would come in and he would pressure people until he got what they wanted. And he would stand toe-to-toe with them on how he's seen ideas. But he was also very good at knowing people's names and getting with them and finding out about things. So Johnson becomes president. He was the VP and becomes president, and he has a platform known as his Great Society. Okay, the programs were to help the poor, access to education and unemployment. Poverty was a personal failure to Johnson. No discussion for institutional problems. Liberal and superficial Cold War political movements. He wanted Head Start and preschool. He was for Upward Bound, for disadvantaged and troubled youth. He helped create the Job Corps high school retention program. He also looked at domestic peace corps, aid to families with dependent children, public broadcasting, PBS, Clean Air Act of 1963, Wilderness Act of 1964, and Clean Water Act of 1966. Those were items that were very important to Johnson. He thought that we would be better people if we could clean up and take care of what we had here. The Great Society was one of his most notable contributions. Medicaid and Medicare come in here. We need to remember that Medicare takes care of elderly, Medicaid takes care of the younger, and he wanted to bring people out of poverty. He also helped create the Office of Economic Opportunity, the Equal Opportunity Act. The problem was the Equal Opportunity Act did fail miserably. People felt that there was enough equal opportunity, even though there is a pay scale difference. There is, people getting jobs does not always play equal. They appropriated double to nearly $2 billion. The Appalachian Region Development Act of 1966, Congress allocated $1.1 billion to redevelop the isolated mountain areas and make sure they had clean water and sewage. Elementary Schools and Secondary Act of 1965, more than $1 billion given for elementary aid and secondary education. Head Start prepared educational disadvantaged children for elementary school. Medicare Act of 1965, passed for the elderly. Supported by millions of Americans to push poverty away, was skyrocketed by medical cost. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, was created in 1966. So here's giving the Johnson treatment. That's a great picture of the Johnson treatment where he's pressuring to make sure his point comes through. So the Great Society achievements. The 24th Amendment, abolishing the poll tax of federal elections. Civil Rights Bill of 1964. Johnson's skill with Congress allowed him to get Kennedy to pass bills. And the provisions forbid segregation in hotels, motels, restaurants, lunch counters, theater, support arena, that businesses that did interstate commerce. That's how they enforced it. If your business did interstate commerce, if they got their goods from another state, they could no longer discriminate at their lunch counters, at their hotels. Equal Opportunity Employment Commission was created to enforce laws on that to make sure people could get in. Relieved individuals' responsibility for bringing discrimination complaints to courts themselves. Federal government was now responsible. Eliminated remaining restrictions on blacks to vote. Title VII, discrimination based on race, religion, gender, and national origin was illegal. Results, most businesses in the South cities, larger towns, desegregated immediately. Voting Rights Act of 1965. Legislation did not address the 15th Amendment guarantee to the right to everyone to vote. And all of that is successes. Okay? All of that gave way to what we needed for this great society to work. Expanding protest. Okay? We have several protests that happened during this time. The SNCC and Stokely Carmichael were influenced by Malcolm X. In 1966, they called for civil rights movements to be staffed, controlled, and financed by blacks, thus rejecting interracial cooperation. Black nationalists replaced integration as a goal. They looked at black power. They looked at attempts to seize political power in Alabama elections, that it would change things. Carmichael later became a member of the Black Panthers based in Oakland, founded by an urban revolutionary, Henry Newton and Bobby Seals. The revolutionary social movement organized African American men in the North and Western cities to fight for liberation. And that became important. So then we have the Freedom Rides, where people were gaining support to go and strike and go with Martin Luther King and to ride and to figure out exactly what they needed to do to be a presence down there, so it would make changes. They figured the more people they could get to go for the Freedom Rides, the better it would be, and change would happen faster. So here is a picture of one of the Freedom Rides. 360 jailed in Jackson, 9 arrested in Birmingham. There's the wonderful letter that Martin Luther King writes from the Birmingham jail. It's very much a commitment to how we can make changes in Alabama, how we can change things in Mississippi, how we can make it be more equal and people working. Now, we all know Martin Luther King wanted nonviolent protest. He really felt that nonviolent protests would be better for everyone, and their point would get across faster with nonviolence. The March on Washington, the march from Salem to Washington. Only 383 out of the 15,000 African Americans registered to vote in Salem, Alabama. After 2 months of beating, arrest, and 1 murder, civil rights leaders in Salem announced a climatic protest from Salem to Montgomery. The first march, state troopers violently ended the march on the bridge outside of Salem. On March 9th, Martin Luther King led the second march. At this time, he halted on the bridge and marched back to Salem as the protesters sang, "We shall overcome." King had agreed to President Johnson's request to discontinue the march. On March 15th, Johnson promised on TV to send a bill to Congress that would extend voting rights to African Americans in the Deep South. March 21st proceeded peacefully from Salem to Montgomery with protection of federalized Alabama National Guards. Literacy tests were unlawful, and if less than 50% of all voting citizens were registered, if so, African Americans could enroll whether or not they could read. Local registrars would not enroll African Americans. The president could send federal examiners who would. This gave teeth to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As a result, 740,000 African Americans registered to vote in 3 years. Hundreds of African Americans elected by the late 1960s in the South. African Americans no longer feared white reprisal during elections. Southerners now began to court African American voters and businesses. For the first time since Reconstruction, African Americans migrated to the South. So then we have the march to Washington, on how people would come and see and listen to the I Have a Dream speech. There were so many people there. There were so many people that were looking at what was going to happen. It was an insightful time for people. People wanted to make the change no matter what your race was. Freedom Summer. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Legislation did not address the 15th Amendment guaranteed to vote. Affirmative action. The Freedom Summer was a 3-year summer that people looked at to change things, and to go and march. Okay, Voting Rights Act was approved because of that. Affirmative action. Johnson signed an executive order in 1965 requiring employers of federal contacts to take affirmative action to ensure underprivileged minorities and women were hired. President Nixon later furthered the affirmative action. Countless American corporations that did business with government, colleges, and universities that received federal scholarships and research funding became obligated to meet the guidelines. As a result, Black, Asian, Hispanic enrollment in universities increased dramatically. The 1970s saw a reverse discrimination on the economic began to suffer, and whites faced increased competition for jobs that were denied promotion, and students were denied college information. There was a Supreme Court case known as Blake. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that Alan Blake, a white medical school student, was unfairly turned down from medical school because of the admission program that favored minorities. The court declared preference to admission could not be given to any member of a group based on ethnic or racial identity alone. Jesse Jackson became the leader of Advocate between the 70s and 80s, counting affirmative action during the civil rights. Affirmative action was weakened by the Supreme Court in the late 80s and 90s. In 1967, President Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall, the first African American, to the Supreme Court. And they dealt with forced busing issues. In 1968, the Supreme Court ordered the end to de facto segregation in public schools. Court ordered school districts to bus children from all minority neighborhoods in the center of a city to achieve integration of schools. Issues became controversial with the middle-class suburbs and the whites in the 70s and 90s. African American civil rights movement, in retrospect, between the years of 1954 and 1968 was known as the Second Reconstruction. Equality before the law largely achieved. Other minorities, women, Native American, Hispanics, gays, looked to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s to model their own era. Racial violence. Poverty, unemployment, racial discrimination were common factors in major inner cities. Empty promises of racial equality in the North initiated rage in many African American communities. The Long Hot Summers. Between 1965 through 1967, there was racial disorder. It hit Watts riot in Los Angeles between August 11th and the 16th of 1965. 34 people dead, 1,072 injured, 4,000 arrested, 1,000 buildings destroyed, and nearly $40 million in lost property. In 1967, in Detroit, 7,000 arrested, white businesses targeted, but many black businesses were inadvertently burned. Snipers prevented firefighters from doing their work. During the first 9 months of 1967, more than 150 cities reported incidents of racial disorder. Kearns Commission, appointed by LBJ to investigate the riots, concluded frustrated hopes of the African Americans led to violence. Approval and encouragement of violence both with white terrorists and with black protest groups led to violence. Blacks had a sense of being powerless in a society dominated by whites. Recommendation: eliminated of all racial barriers in jobs, education, and housing, greater public response for problems of racial minorities, and increased communication across racial lines. Black power. The rise of black power and racial violence. Not all African Americans agreed with Martin Luther King's nonviolent methods. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, King seemed to lose some of the young blacks. Many questioned whether it was a good idea for blacks to try to integrate with white. Black separatism, one, called the separate of races in America to return to Africa or occupy an exclusive area of land in the U.S. supplied by the federal government. Opposition to integration. Inspired by the ideas of Marcus Garvey during the Harlem Resistance, the Nation of Islam, the Black Muslim movement, most notably organized by Malcolm X. Most vocal and brilliant narrator of the Nation of Islam was Malcolm X. Preached religious justifications for black separation and furthering African American rights at any means possible. Advocated the use of weapons for self-defense, believing nonviolence encouraged white violence. Many of the white communities were alarmed. His views softened after his pilgrimage to Mecca. He left the Nation of Islam and on February 21st, 1965, was assassinated by 3 members of the Nation of Islam. He never supported King's nonviolence methods. White people should thank Dr. King for holding black people in check, is what he felt. And there was the Black Panthers that came in. That was a group started in California that really looked at, they were okay with being strong and violent. It was okay to use force. Flexibility response for the Cold War. Bay of Pigs. In 1960, Eisenhower authorized the CIA to organize, train, and arm the Central American Brigade of 1,400 Cuban exiles for an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. Invaders would presumably trigger a population uprising in Cuba. JFK continued the plan. In April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion pinned down and forced the surrender. Kennedy had decided a day earlier against direct U.S. intervention and did not want to spark an international diplomatic crisis. Some 1,189 men were captured, 400 were killed, only 14 exiles rescued. Cuban people did not support the invasion. Kennedy took full responsibility on TV and was ill-conceived mission. Privately, Kennedy blamed the CIA for the faulty information. Significance: brought USSR and Cuba together closer than they had planned for the defense of the future invasion of the U.S. Operation Mongoose was called in. The CIA planned to overthrow and assassinate Fidel Castro, ultimately failed and abandoned after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was not a good thing. Part of it was we didn't go in with a full force, and if we would have, it would have been better, but we didn't. So the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, Khrushchev, the leader of Russia, began placing nuclear weapons in Cuba, 90 miles off the Florida coast. Soviets intended to use a weapon to force the U.S. to back down on Berlin, Cuba, and other troubled areas. Only the Pacific Northwest was out of range for the Soviet missiles. October 14th, an aerial photograph revealed Russians were secretly sending transmission of nuclear missiles. Warning missile attacks would shrink from 30 minutes to 2 minutes. U.S. unaware of tactical missiles were also in Cuba, designed to destroy invasion armies. Soviets also had nuclear cruise missiles to destroy U.S. Navy near Cuba. October 22nd, JFK orders a naval quarantine of Cuba and demands immediate removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. Kennedy also stated the attack of Cuba on the U.S. or other Latin American countries would result in a retaliatory response from the Soviet Union. Organized, the American states had given Kennedy their full support. Kennedy rejected the strategic bombing strikes and against launching missile sites, fearing it might mean war. No guarantees that the missile would be hit. Also rejected the invasion of Cuba. Many of the cabinet members favored this. Unbeknownst to Kennedy, the Soviet tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba could have destroyed the invading American army. U.S. had invaded in World War II and most likely had begun there. Kennedy had announced the national television, America was shocked. All U.S. forces were put on alert for a week. The world watched as the Soviet ships carrying the missiles steamed towards Cuba. And the U.S. attack triggered the war between the U.S. and Russia. October 24th, 16 Soviet ships stopped before they reached the blockade. On October 26th, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles if the U.S. removed missiles from Turkey, vowing it would not attack Cuba. This agreement was publicly favored by Kennedy as the Soviets quietly pulled its Turkish missiles out 6 months later. The agreement can be seen as a victory for Khrushchev. He saved Cuba and got the U.S. missiles removed out of Turkey. We had a new spirit of cooperation. Kennedy and Khrushchev realized they had come dangerously too close to war. Then they wanted to prevent it from ever happening again. And so we had the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, July of 1963. The ban was an atmosphere testing of nuclear weapons, sea, land, outer space. Khrushchev did refuse on-site inspections. did not reduce the stockpiles, signed by all major powers except for France and China. Kennedy considered the treaty his greatest achievement. A hotline was installed with 24-hour access between Moscow and Washington. And that's where we see in all the old movies the red phone, that it was a direct line to the Soviet Union so that we could stop war. So this is a picture of the United States in Latin America, where different things have been done, okay? You know, like in the Dominican Republic, from 1965 to 1965, occupied by U.S. forces following the overthrow of Trujillo. 1994, the U.S. intervenes on behalf of Estreen. Haiti. You know, we have lots of things where we've been in and out. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala. Flexible response. In 1961, after the assassinations that killed dictator General Trujillo, Johnson dispatched 30,000 troops to quell the ongoing disorder and help the Dominican Republic. Well, then we, of course, have the Vietnam War. And what I want you all to remember with the Vietnam War is, when we are at war with Vietnam, we know about this problem with Franklin Roosevelt, okay? That we knew that there is a problem in Vietnam. We know that there is conflict in this area. So the Vietnam War spread over 5 presidencies, 25 years. Direct involvement in from the United States was from 1963 to 1973. So you've got 3 full presidents that it was direct involvement. Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. France lost control of Vietnam after the Battle of Dien Phu in 1954. The U.S. by 1954 had financed about 80% of the war, France's war. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communists in Vietnam, was the leader, and he wanted to take control of all of Vietnam and have them be under one leader. Geneva Convention in 1954 agreed to reach a divided country into the north and south along the 17th parallel until 1956, unifying elections. Ho Chi Minh accepted based on assurances that Vietnam-wide elections would occur within 2 years. Eisenhower refused to sign the Geneva Agreement. And this is where we get what's known as the domino theory. If one country falls to communism, the other surrounding countries will fall one right after the other, like a domino, including Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, China. Well, China had already fallen, and they just think everything's going to happen here. In the South, pro-Western governments under the Ninh Dong Niem took control in Saigon. The Vietnam Civil War. Dinh Dong Niem regime was U.S.-backed, nationalist, fierce anti-communist. He was aloof, Catholic, autocrat ruling over the nation of poor Buddhist peasants. Ninh canceled the elections in 1956, and it severely divided the country. U.S. supported him, did not want Ho Chi Minh to win the election because Ho Chi Minh wants communism. South Vietnam is in disarray at the war and the colonial rule. Eisenhower promises economic and military aid to Nang's regime in return for social reform. Reform is extremely slow. $4 to $5 went to the military. 4 out of $5 went to the military. Dulles creates the Southeast Asia Treaty in order to prop up Diem's regime. Branch and France are included, and it's supported by NATO. In response, the Viet Cong was formed in the south to tie Ho Chi Minh to the north. Consisted of the Vietnamese and other groups opposing Nong, supported by China and the Soviet Union, promised economic reform, reunification of the north, genuine independence from other countries, and they wanted to topple the pro-American government from power. Ninh is assassinated, and the war comes in as a result. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Early in 1964, Johnson announced that the Vietnam had torpedo boats had attacked two U.S. destroyers in international water on August 2nd and 4th, patrolling off of the coast of Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. The attacks were unprovoked. Congress must unanimously pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Johnson was given more authority to widen the war effort without waiting for Congress to declare war. Years later, it became known that the U.S. ships were helping South Vietnamese commando raids in North Vietnam Island, and the attack was not unprovoked. In response, Johnson ordered a limited retaliatory raid in the North Vietnam air bases and sought no wider war. LBJ used the episode effectively during the 1964 campaign. He did one of his major commercials then. It's known as the Daisy commercial. I'll add that to the thing. You need to watch that commercial where you watch the bomb. It circles in on a little girl's eye, and then you see the bomb blow up. The major points. LBJ's major error was using the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to justify his widening of war without seeking congressional approval and a popular approval. He sought to protect his Great Society programs by keeping the war decisions more secretively and putting more money within our country and not what was going on in Vietnam. His lack of trust of the Joint Chiefs of Staff after the Cuban Missile Crisis meant to top military officials were not part of the war policy process. No evidence exists that LBJ intentionally sought to escalate the war. The strategy premises on behalf of the United States could inflict so many casualties, so much damage, that the enemy would be eventually unable and unwilling to fight. This strategy failed. The act was forcibly suppressing or eliminating the population considered to be hostile. So here's the picture of Vietnam. Here's the demilitarized zone, okay? And the Viet Cong, you see, they will go into Laos here to come back in and fight. They didn't always go down a direct line. At-home movement. The movement against the involvement of the United States in Vietnam began in the U.S. during demonstrations in 1964 and grew in strength in later years. The U.S. became polarized between those advocating continued involvement in Vietnam and those who wanted peace. Many of the peace movement were students, mothers, anti-establishments, hippies. Opposition grew with anticipation and participation by the African American civil rights movement, women liberation, Chicano movement, sectors organized labor. In addition, the involvement came from many other groups, including educators, clergy, academics, journalists, lawyers, physicians, including Benjamin Spock, civil rights movement leaders, and military veterans. Opposition consists mainly of peaceful, nonviolent events. Few were deliberately provoked violence. In some cases, police used violent tactics against demonstrators. By 1970, a steady increase of majority of Americans considered the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam to be a mistake, echoed decades later by the heading of American war planning and former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. The Tent Offensive began in 1968, beginning with the end of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Moreland and other officers had been claiming the war's end was coming into view in 68. Now remember, the war doesn't end until 73. Tent New Year was January of 1968. Massive coordinated strikes on North Vietnam. 67,000 Viet Congs attacked 100 cities, bases, and embassies. Offensive lasted approximately 1 month. Thousands of casualties on both sides. The 10th offensive, not military success for Vietnam, was psychologically destroying American hopes. Eugene McCarthy, a liberal from Minnesota, ran as an anti-war campaign in New Hampshire and nearly got half the votes on March 12th, inspired Robert Kennedy to win. At this point, Johnson realizes he cannot run for president again. Okay, and he removes his name and says, I'm not running for president. This is where Robert Kennedy decides he is going to run for president. Okay, and when Robert Kennedy decides he's going to run for president, he travels the world. People loved Robert Kennedy. And Martin Luther King, 68 is a big year. Lots of demonstrations, lots of things going on. So Martin Luther King is assassinated at the hotel, and he is shot by Eugene McCarthy. He is shot by James Earl Ray. He was an American criminal convicted of the assassination of the civil rights and anti-war activist Martin Luther King Jr. Ray was convicted on March 10, 1969, after entering a guilty plea to forego a jury trial. He had been found guilty by trial and would have been eligible for the death penalty. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Later, he recanted his confession and tried unsuccessfully to gain a new trial. He died in prison of hepatitis C in April 23, 1998. Well, then Robert Kennedy decides that he's going to run for president, and they have the Democratic National Convention in California. And Robert Kennedy is winning the primaries in California over Eugene McCarthy. Remember, he's the one that was on an anti-war campaign. And the assassin was Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian. And it was assured that Vice President Herbert Hoover, the presidential Democratic nomination, the riots in the Democratic National Convention between Chicago police and anti-war activists, the nation would watch the riots on television. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon. Spiro Agnew was his running mate, and it aimed to appeal Southern voters. Agnew thought that the African Americans would have a problem with him because he was tough on African Americans. Part of Nixon's Southern strategy, Nixon committed to continuing the war until the enemy settles an honorable peace, similar to Humphrey's position. And George C. Wallace of Alabama led the Independent Party, America's Independent Party. Kennedy is assassinated. And now in this era of the 1960s, you have JFK that has been assassinated, you have Malcolm X that's been assassinated, you have Robert Kennedy that's been assassinated, you have Martin Luther King that's been assassinated. And this is a big deal. People are feeling the violence. People are feeling the protest. It's not a peaceful time by any means. So you have the election, November of 1968. Robert Kennedy's assassination after winning California primary over Eugene McCarthy. And Herbert Hoover becomes the Democratic candidate. Richard Nixon is, of course, the Republican candidate. And George Wallace is the independent. George Wallace takes those southern states. He is all about people getting back to their roots and how we can clean the race back up. All of that is coming in. So there's Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon brings us a lot of things going on. I remember Richard Nixon being president. I was a little kid. But there's a lot of turmoil that happens under Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon does not unite the country. There's a lot of issues that come in with him as president. People felt he was sneaky. Here's the Vietnam Memorial. It's very breathtaking to see in person. There's the Washington Monument behind it. Where that lady's standing, when that gets wet, it's very slick. When I was in D.C., it was pouring rain, and we actually slipped on it and fell to the ground. It was not funny at all. But you can read the names of the veterans that died. It was very sad when those veterans came home. A lot of them were told to not wear their uniform home, and they were spit on. And a lot of those Vietnam vets were very interested in making sure that people were able to vote before they went to war. So they were one of the first to help with the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, were suffrage for 18 to 21-year-olds so that they could vote, so they would have a say in whether or not they want. The last person drafted was in 1973. That's when our last draft happened. Those kind of things come in with these Vietnam veterans, and they're very much pro to support anybody in the military today. Okay, you're ready to take your next test. Go ahead and make sure you get that done, and make sure you're taking care of things. If you have any questions for me, please make sure that you send me an email, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Have a great day, guys.